Up to this point we have pulled several threads together, and perhaps it might be useful from the Western perspective to bring these ideas into a simplified form. We have not yet shown the entire point and purpose of some of the ideas we have touched upon. And we have not delved deeply into the weeds regarding the archaeological and linguistic path of evidence for the claims made here. There is a reason for that. Zachariah Sitchin did a marvelous and comprehensive study of the direct written evidence of our complete thesis here in his Earth Chronicles series of books. It is a massive work, and we have no need to reproduce it here. And the only serious rebuttal offered is around the periphery, a bit of linguistic nitpicking regarding ancient Semitic language. A dispute between experts that stands in the gargantuan shadow of the great revelation of our origins. The linguistic period of dispute is long after the actual events that started and shaped the history of mankind. Frankly, it is feeble. It only stands because it concerns the language of the Jewish Torah, which has been adopted as the core of the Old Testament of the Christians. This is where the objection finally centers in the West, and from Islam as well. It is about faith. But there is no shame in that. In fact, despite the fact that the central premise of much of today's faith in the West is faulty, and is based on historical conflation of facts and concepts. Yet still, the fact of faith, the practices of faith, are actually of paramount importance in the bringing of order out of chaos, and in maintaining that order as chaos seeks to reassert dominance. As Jordan Peterson has pointed out in the past, the desired balance of the two is illustrated in the well-known Taoist symbol. This is the great irony. But it begs explanation. Jordan Peterson here gives a very compelling argument for the necessity of a monotheistic God. To my mind, this is in large measure the reason we have monotheism in the West and why it has become so successful. And this seems to function independent of the historical factual basis, as I believe it must. In this part he gives a fascinating construction of how mankind gets to the essence of virtue itself.
So all of this is to say that there is something very interesting about the pattern of behavior. So imagine that sexual selection is working something like this, and we know that sexual selection is a very, 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 very powerful biological force, even though biologists ignored it for almost 100 years after Charles Darwin originally wrote about it, thinking mostly about natural selection. They didn't like the idea of sexual selection because it tended to introduce the notion of mind into the process of evolution, because it deals with choice. But so imagine on the one hand that you have a male hierarchy. We know that the men at the top of the hierarchy are much more likely to be reproductively successful than the men at the bottom. That's particularly true of men. So you have twice as many female ancestors as you have male ancestors. I'm not going to do the math, and I know it doesn't sound plausible, but you could look it up and figure it out, and it's perfectly reasonable fact that it actually happens to be true. So you have twice as many female ancestors because females are twice as likely on average to leave offspring as men. Now what happens is, any man who does reproduce tends to reproduce more than once, but a bunch of them reproduce zero. Whereas, so it would be the average man who reproduces has 2 children, and the average man who doesn't reproduce has 0, obviously, and the average woman who reproduces has 1 child. So that means that there's twice as many females in your line as there is males. So that's a big deal. And so imagine that it works something like this. So the men elect the competent men who are admired and who are I can't say dominant, who are given positions of authority and respect. Let's put it that way. And it's like an election. Now, it could be an actual democratic election, but it's at least an election of consensus, or it's at least an election of, well, we're not going to kill him for now, which is also a form of election, right? It's a form of tolerance, So, and then what happens is the women, for their part, peel from the top of the male hierarchy. And so you've got 2 factors that are driving human sexual selection across vast stretches of evolutionary time. One is the election of men by men to positions where they're much more likely to reproduce. And the second is the tendency of women to peel off the top of male dominance hierarchies, which is extraordinarily well established cross-culturally. Even if you flatten out the socioeconomic disparity, say, between men and women, like they've done in Scandinavia, you don't reduce the tendency of women to peel off the top of the male hierarchy by much. And why would you? I mean, women are smart. Why in the world wouldn't they go why wouldn't they strive to make relationships with men who are relatively successful? And why wouldn't they let the men themselves define how that constitutes success. It makes sense. Like, if you want to figure out who the best man is, why not let the men compete, and let the man who wins, whatever the competition is the best man by definition. How else would you define it? So, okay, so why am I telling you all that? Well, the reason is because it seems to me that there's been this complex interplay across human evolution between the election of the male dominance hierarchy and sexual success. And that's a big deal if it's true. It could be, because what would happen, you see, is that as men evolved, they would evolve to be better and better at climbing up the male hierarchy, because the ones who weren't good at that wouldn't reproduce. So obviously that's going to happen. But then it wouldn't just be a hierarchy, because there's a whole bunch of different hierarchies. And so then you might say, well, are there commonalities across hierarchies? That's a reasonable thing to propose. I mean, they're not completely opposed to one another, at least. If you're relatively more successful in one hierarchy, then it's more probable that you'll be successful in another. And that's actually a really good definition of general intelligence, or IQ, and that's actually one of the things that women select men for. Now, men also select women for that, but the selection pressure is even higher from women to men. And general IQ is one of the things that propels you up across dominance hierarchies, because it's a general problem-solving mechanism. And the other thing that seems to do that to some degree is conscientiousness. And there's also some evidence that women prefer conscientious men. So, and of course, why wouldn't they? Because you can trust them, and they work, and so those are both good things. So then you think, okay, so men have adapted to start to climb the male dominance hierarchy, but it's the set of all possible hierarchies that they're adapted to climb. And so then you think there's a set of attributes that can be acted out, that can be embodied, that will increase the probability that you're going to rise to the top of any given hierarchy. And then you could say, well, then as you adapt to that fact, then you start to develop an understanding of what that pattern constitutes. And so that starts to become the abstract representation of something like multidimensional competence. And that's like the abstraction of virtue itself. Well, and none of that's arbitrary, man. That's as bloody well grounded in biology as anything could be. And I think that's a really hard argument to refute.
This is a very biologically well-grounded beginning for what we might later think is an egregore. An egregore of the highest and most lasting kind, perhaps the essence of what an egregore actually is. But more on that later.
And so, is it so unreasonable to think that we would have actually, over the millennia, come to some sort of collective conclusion about what the best of the best guys are, best of the good guys are, and what the worst of the bad guys are? And to me, archetypally speaking, thinking of that as the hostile brothers, so that's Christ and Satan, or Cain and Abel, for example, very common mythological motif, the hostile brothers. It's like, those are archetypes. It's like the Satan, for example, is by definition the worst that a person can be. And Christ, by definition, this is independent of anything but conceptualization, is by definition the best that a man can be. Now, as I said, I'm speaking psychologically and conceptually, but given our capacity for imagination and our ability to engage in fiction, and our love for fiction, and our capacity to dramatize, and our love for the stories of heroism and catastrophe and good and evil, I can't see how it could be any other way. So that's part of the idea that's driving the notion of the evolution of the idea of God, and even more specifically, driving the evolution of the idea, at least in part, of the Trinity. So God is an abstracted ideal formulated in large part to dissociate the ideal from any particular incarnation or man or any ruler. And there's another rule in the biblical stories, which is that when the actual ruler, I mentioned this before, when the actual ruler becomes confused with the abstracted ideal, then the state immediately turns into a tyranny and the whole bloody thing collapses. So the idea is so sophisticated. You know, one of the things that we figured out, and this was a hard thing to figure out, was that you had to take the abstraction and divorce it from any particular power structure, and then think about it as something that existed as an abstraction, but a real thing, right? Real in that it governed your behavior, in everyone's behavior, including the damn king. The king was responsible to the abstracted ideal. Man, that is such an impossible ideal. You know, why would have they agreed to that 5,000 years ago? But one of the things you see continually happening in the Old Testament is that as soon as the Israelite, for example, the Israelite kings become almighty, the real God comes along and just cuts them into pieces, and then the whole bloody state falls apart for like hundreds of years. It's like, I think that's a lesson that we have not thoroughly, consciously yet learned. It's still implicit in the narratives. We still haven't figured out why that's the case.
That last comment is fascinating. When the king of Israel thinks he is God, the real God comes along and wipes out the entire place and they have to start over. Who might that be? That sounds a lot like Enlil, and the way he tended to operate. I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. Absolutely. There have been a lot of people that have asked the question, why is the God of the Old Testament so severe and vengeful but the God of the New Testament is forgiving? The answer is that the God of the Old Testament was the God Enlil, and the God of the New Testament is the version of God that Jordan Peterson is talking about, the creation of the abstraction, the God of the superlatives, the monotheistic ideal. As a supplement to Jordan Peterson's construction, we may want to look at this from another perspective. The esoteric world, the occult world, has understood the principle that the human mind is powerful, and combined with many other minds to a single purpose, or a single pattern or belief, or a complete structure of belief, this power can be immense. We might say it is the classic strength in numbers. In our time we have seen manifestations of this on a smaller scale, yet in a way that we can recognize the power of the collective mind. Cults are classic examples of this. Yet there are other large forces that work because of the collective consciousness of many people. Mark Stavish is one that has studied this phenomenon from the perspective of a student and practitioner of aspects of the occult. His name for the phenomenon is Egregore. He has written extensively about egregores, in particular a book specifically on the subject. Here are some excerpts from an interview with Barbara DeLong that do a great job of explaining this.
There's really two definitions of an egregore, but they fundamentally, it's the same thing. It's just a matter of whether you want to look at the classical view or the modern view. And in the modern view, it is a type of collective consciousness. So whenever you're in any group, there's a kind of groupthink that takes place. And that can be anything from your local knitting club to the PTA to your church or even to your local political parties or anything or baseball team. Whatever you happen to be in, any group has a certain group attitude that it begins to cultivate. We see this very powerfully, particularly in now places of employment, where you talk about the corporate codes of ethics. Not just ethics, but also corporate culture. That's really the word I'm looking for. So when we see these cultures develop, that is, in a sense, an egregore, because there's that which is of the culture inside of it, and that which is outside of it. Okay, we're familiar with that. Now, traditionally, an egregore was more than just that. Not only was it, we'll say, the corporate culture of a religion or a sect or a particular cult around a deity, but it also was a conduit between the priestcraft and the followers on terra firma down here, all the way through the psychic or the astral realms, whatever you want to think of them as, and intelligences in those realms, ultimately to an ultimate intelligence of some kind. And that final intelligence could be a deity, or, well, whatever you wanted to think of it as, whether a god, an archangel, maybe some might think of it as an enlightened being, others a demon, who knows, but there was always something else or other at the other end, and that the egregore was the conduit or funnel that connected us down here on the earth to it. And they begin to go out on the spiritual path. It's all very nice, and they think everything is wonderful and bright and beautiful, and it's all, unicorns and rainbows. But, the human experience is in many ways a tragic one.
Does the egregore that is created depend upon the belief system of those that create it?
Yes. It reflects it, and it reinforces it. And then it can even to some degree survive after it, because there's so much energy. Think of it as...
Yeah, give an example of an egregore that has survived beyond its whatever.
Egypt, ancient Egypt is a spectacular one. I mean, ancient Egypt hasn't existed in what? I don't know.
Yeah.
Let's see, 1,600 years. Let's go back to I'm thinking 480. Hasn't really existed, and then Pharaonic Egypt is even older than that. What we think of as Egypt is Pharaonic. That goes back even further. The dynastic Egypt. So, and yet it's existed. I mean, it still fascinates us. It overwhelms us, and that's a positive one. We use it as a positive one. There are other egregores that exist in their own way. There are fascinations, but I like that one the most because people can immediately identify with it and grasp it.
So then, once we're living egregore. Now I can't even say it. Egregore.
Yeah.
So once vibrant and alive egregores have, because they have not been continuously fueled and practiced, become myth and fable over time.
To some degree. Yeah, I mean, a lot of them were myth and fable to begin with, but they were living myth and fable. Now what you're saying is they become a different kind of myth and fable. I mean, they become a fascination. I mean, during the Renaissance is in many ways a fascination, not only with Greco-Roman ideas, but also with Egyptian ideas. It was the Corpus Hermeticum that generated the Renaissance as we know it, as we understand it. So that being said, there is this obsession with Egyptian things for a period of time, and that comes and goes. There's an Egyptian obsession in the late 18th century, and again in the late 19th century. So these energies or these ideas, they grab a hold of our imagination. As soon as they grab a hold of the imagination, they grab a hold of our emotions. It's no different than advertising. But with the egregore that we're talking about, the question is there a psychic force behind it? Is there an intelligence? Can that god or goddess help me in some way? Can I develop a relationship with it that helps me to expand my awareness? Whereas with an advertising, it's just to grab your imagination to get you to buy a car or drink some Coke or, vote for a candidate or something like that.
We will pause here and take the time in another video installment to dig more deeply into this subject. Perhaps you can see where we are going with this, but I think our conclusions might come as a surprise.